My brother emptied our parents' bank account before the funeral even ended. My brother emptied our parents' bank account while the minister was still describing what kind people they had been. I know the exact moment because my phone vibrated against the wooden pew at 11:17 that morning, and when I glanced down, the banking app showed a balance of $0.43. 10 minutes earlier, the account had held $1,846,220.43. The proceeds from the sale of our parents' warehouse, their retirement savings, and enough operating cash to keep 32 employees paid through the winter. Across the aisle, Nolan sat beside his wife with his head bowed and one hand covering his eyes. Everyone thought he was grieving. I watched the blue light of his second phone disappear into his jacket and understood that my brother had used our parents' funeral as cover to rob them. I did not stand up. I did not shout his name or interrupt the prayer. That restraint would later be described by Nolan's lawyer as proof that I had not been alarmed, but the truth was simpler. Shock does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it sharpens every detail until the world becomes unbearable. I noticed the dust trapped in the sunlight above the caskets. I heard my aunt's bracelet scrape the hymn book. I could smell the lilies Nolan had ordered with money he had not yet paid the florist. On my screen, 4 transfers appeared in a row. $480,000, $500,000, $500,000, and $366,220. The destination was an account belonging to North Coast Strategic Holdings, an LLC I recognized because Nolan had asked our father to invest in it 3 months earlier. Dad had refused. The app displayed another detail Nolan had apparently overlooked. The transfers were pending review. My parents had placed a dual verification restriction on that account after an incident the previous year, and every movement above $50,000 generated alerts to 2 people. One alert went to the primary account holder, the other came to me. Nolan knew I helped our parents with payroll and taxes, but he believed I was only an authorized viewer. He did not know that 6 weeks before their deaths, they had made me successor co-trustee and instructed the bank to treat any transaction initiated with Dad's old security token after incapacity or death as suspected fraud. He also did not know that the bank's fraud director was already calling me. I silenced the call and sent one message. Account holders deceased. Freeze all outgoing transfers. Preserve access logs. Then I put my phone face down and listened as the minister spoke about integrity. Nolan remained bent over, performing grief so carefully that he did not notice me watching him. I could have exposed him before 200 mourners. Part of me wanted to. Another part remembered my mother's last clear instruction: do not fight Nolan in public when documents can make him fight himself. So I waded through the final hymn, walked behind both caskets, accepted condolences, and let my brother believe he had become a millionaire before lunch. Our parents, Ruth and Daniel Mercer, had built Mercer Home Supply from a rented storefront and a delivery van that stalled whenever it rained. By the time Nolan and I were adults, the company had 4 stores, a contractor division, and a warehouse on 12 acres near the interstate. It was not the kind of wealth that appeared in magazines. It was inventory, land, forklifts, customer credit, and years when Dad returned home smelling of lumber, while Mom sat at the kitchen table matching invoices to receipts. They lived comfortably but never extravagantly. Dad still repaired his own mower. Mom reused gift bags until the tape gave up. Their money represented 40 years of work, which was precisely why Nolan believed he deserved it. Nolan was 3 years older than I was, and had been called the natural heir before either of us understood inheritance. He looked like Dad, shook hands like Dad, and could enter a crowded room without doubting that people wanted him there. I was quieter and better with systems. At 16, I reorganized the stockroom because the same plumbing fittings had been ordered under 3 item codes. Nolan sold a deck package to our neighbor and was praised for possessing business instinct. Nobody intended the comparison to become cruel, but it hardened into family mythology. Nolan was the face. I was the person behind the counter fixing what the face promised. When Nolan joined Mercer Home Supply after college, Dad gave him responsibility for commercial sales. Within 2 years, he had the largest accounts and a new title. His numbers looked impressive because he offered long payment terms and discounts that erased much of the profit. Whenever Mom questioned the margins, Nolan argued that growth required courage. Dad admired courage, especially when it sounded like his own younger voice. I studied accounting, worked for a regional logistics company, and returned to Mercer only when Mom needed surgery. What began as 6 weeks helping with payroll became 5 years managing finance, operations, insurance, and all the unphotogenic work required to keep a growing business real. Nolan considered my return an invasion. He had imagined Dad retiring and handing him the company without an audit of what came before. Instead, I found customer accounts 90 days overdue, inventory missing from 2 stores, and vendor rebates routed through a marketing company Nolan controlled. He explained each issue separately. Contractors were slow to pay. Inventory records were old-fashioned. The marketing company allowed flexibility. Dad wanted peace, so every discussion ended with a compromise that required me to clean the numbers, while Nolan kept the authority that created them. Mom noticed. She began sitting beside me after hours, learning how much of the company's apparent growth was supported by loans and delayed bills. The first undeniable theft involved a cabin our parents owned near Lake Briar. Nolan presented Dad with papers he described as refinancing documents for a store renovation. Buried among them was a personal guarantee securing a $350,000 loan to North Coast Strategic Holdings. The collateral schedule included the cabin. Nolan signed Dad's name on one page and used an electronic copy of Mom's signature on another. The lender called our office after a payment default. I answered because Nolan was at a golf tournament, and within an hour, I was looking at signatures my parents had never made. Dad's first reaction was disbelief, then shame. He kept asking whether Nolan might have misunderstood the documents, as if accidental forgery were a category that could save us. Mom did not search for softer language. She called the lender, hired attorney Miriam Shaw, and demanded the entire file. Metadata showed the forms had been created on Nolan's laptop. The verification email had gone to an address differing from Dad's by 1 letter. When confronted, Nolan admitted using the cabin as collateral, but insisted he had meant to repay the loan before anyone knew. He described the forgery as temporary paperwork and the money as a bridge to an investment that would benefit the family. That was Nolan's gift. He could take a completed act and describe it as an unfinished intention. Theft became borrowing before repayment. Deception became protection from unnecessary worry. A failed gamble became vision interrupted by timing. Dad wanted to believe him, but Mom asked the question Nolan could not decorate. If the investment was for the family, why had the ownership documents given 90% of it to Nolan and 10% to his wife? He had no answer. He left the house furious, accusing me of turning our parents against him because I wanted control of the company. The lender released the cabin after Mercer Home Supply paid $112,000 to cure the default, and Nolan surrendered another asset. Dad did not press charges. That decision haunted him. He removed Nolan's signing authority, but he could not bring himself to fire his son publicly. Nolan was moved into business development with spending limits and no access to banking. Customers were told he was focusing on strategic relationships. Inside the family, silence became the price of staying together. Nolan interpreted mercy as proof that consequences could always be negotiated. Mom did not. With Miriam's help, she and Dad reorganized their estate. The company shares moved into the Mercer Family Trust. The warehouse was sold because maintaining it had become expensive, and the sale proceeds went into a restricted transition account. Dad retained a physical security token for routine transfers, but any transaction above $50,000 required confirmation from a second trustee. If both parents died, resigned, or became incapacitated, the token was supposed to be surrendered and deactivated. I was named successor co-trustee with Miriam for 90 days, after which an independent fiduciary would oversee distribution. Nolan would not learn those details until the formal trust meeting. My parents did not disinherit him. That matters. They left both children equal beneficial shares after debts, taxes, employee obligations, and verified claims were settled. But they added a conduct provision. Any beneficiary who knowingly took trust property without authorization, concealed a liability, destroyed records, or interfered with administration would lose the right to serve in management and would have the unauthorized amount charged against his share. It was not a dramatic no contest clause. It was an accounting rule. Take early, receive less later. Lie about it, lose control. Mom called it the scale that Nolan could balance himself. I disliked being placed at the center. I told them Nolan would assume I had designed the provision. Dad looked exhausted when he answered that Nolan already blamed me whenever numbers resisted him. Mom said they were no longer planning around what accusation would make Nolan comfortable. They asked me to follow the documents, protect payroll, and allow an independent investigation if anything happened. I signed because refusing would not make our family safer. It would only leave the next person less prepared. 6 weeks later, my parents died when a truck crossed the median during a storm. There was no final bedside conversation and no opportunity for Dad to deactivate the bank token. A state trooper came to my door shortly after midnight. Nolan arrived at the hospital before dawn, grief making him look younger. For several hours, we were simply two children who had lost both parents at once. He held my shoulders while I cried. I called his wife when he could not form the words. I wanted to believe catastrophe had stripped away the old rivalry and revealed something decent underneath. That belief lasted until the hospital released Dad's personal effects. His wedding ring, wallet, keys, phone, and leather folio were placed in a sealed bag. Because Nolan had arrived first and identified himself as eldest son, a nurse handed the bag to him. I noticed, but did not object in the hallway. We had bodies to release, relatives to inform, and a funeral to plan. Nolan said he would bring everything to the house. He brought the ring and wallet the next day. The phone and banking token were missing. When I asked, he said the phone must still be with the police and that he had never seen a token. The hospital inventory listed both. I emailed the discrepancy to Miriam, who advised me not to confront him without securing the accounts first. The bank placed a watch on the transition account and began disabling Dad's credentials, but the deaths occurred late Friday, and several departments operated on reduced weekend staffing. Dad's token used an older commercial system that could not be fully deactivated until the estate desk verified death certificates. A manager assured me that dual verification would prevent large transfers. I sent temporary certificates and believed the immediate risk contained. Nolan spent the weekend behaving like the son our parents had always hoped he would become. He chose readings, called employees personally, and ordered food for relatives gathering at the house. He volunteered to pay funeral expenses and told everyone I should rest because I had handled enough practical burdens while our parents were alive. My aunts praised him. Even I felt guilty for watching his hands whenever he removed his phone. Grief makes suspicion feel indecent, especially when the person you suspect knows how to perform care. On Sunday evening, Nolan entered Dad's study alone. The security camera over the side entrance showed him carrying a laptop case when he left 2 hours later, though he later claimed he had gone in only to find photographs for the memorial. The study computer had been powered on, and Dad's password manager had been accessed using the recovered phone. Nolan used a printed copy of an old power of attorney to answer a security challenge. That power ended at Dad's death, a basic fact printed in bold on the first page. Nolan knew. He uploaded only the signature page. At 10:52 Monday morning, as the first hymn began, he initiated 4 transfers from the transition account to North Coast. He divided the amount because he believed transfers below $500,001 would pass automatically. He had discovered an obsolete threshold in a procedure manual stored on Dad's computer. What he had not found was the newer dual verification agreement kept in Mom's locked file cabinet and with the bank. The system displayed the money as removed from our parents' available balance, giving him the zero he wanted to see, but it held the transfers in an internal review queue. His theft was both complete enough to prove intent and incomplete enough to recover. After the burial, Nolan stood beside the grave accepting condolences as if he had not just tried to erase our parents' financial life. He hugged me and said we needed to stay united. I remember the cold edge of his watch against my cheek. I asked whether he still had Dad's phone. His body tightened for a fraction of a second before he answered that the police must have lost it. Then he turned toward an elderly supplier and began speaking about carrying on Dad's legacy. I understood that if I accused him there, he would cry, deny, and transform the scene into a dispute between grieving siblings. So I thanked the mourners, got into Miriam's car, and drove directly to the bank. The fraud director, Celeste Park, had already frozen the transfers and preserved the session. Miriam and I presented death certificates, the trust instrument, and my appointment as successor co-trustee. Celeste explained that Nolan had passed several knowledge questions, entered the physical token code, and uploaded a power of attorney. He had also called the commercial help desk from Dad's phone and imitated Dad's phrasing well enough to convince a junior employee that the account holder was ill and unable to speak for long. The recorded call lasted 93 seconds. At the end, Nolan whispered that he needed the transfers completed before noon because his daughter's medical treatment could not wait. Nolan did not have a daughter. Celeste asked whether we wanted the bank to reject the transactions quietly or refer them to law enforcement. The choice felt enormous, though legally it was not entirely mine. The bank had a duty to report suspected financial exploitation and identity fraud involving deceased customers. Miriam reminded me of my parents' written instructions: preserve evidence, use independent professionals, do not bargain privately. I authorized the formal fraud process. Celeste marked the transfers for reversal after forensic imaging. Nolan's North Coast account was restricted before he reached the reception. He discovered the freeze at 2:38 that afternoon. I was at our parents' house helping relatives pack food when he stormed into the kitchen and demanded to speak with me alone. He did not ask why the account was frozen. He accused me of freezing his money. That pronoun ended any remaining uncertainty. I told him the funds belonged to the trust and that all questions should go through Miriam. His face shifted from anger to injured disbelief. He said Dad had promised him control, that the warehouse proceeds were intended for his new distribution project, and that I was humiliating him hours after we buried our parents. I asked for a written agreement. He said Dad's word was enough. I asked why a gift required a dead man's phone, an expired power of attorney, 4 split transfers, and a lie about a non-existent child. Nolan stared at me. For the first time, he realized the bank had kept the call. He lowered his voice and said, "Families handled mistakes privately." I answered that our parents had tried that with the cabin, and he had mistaken privacy for permission. Then I left the room. He followed me into the hall, but 3 relatives were standing there. His performance returned instantly. He asked me not to let stress destroy our family. By evening, Nolan had begun building his version of events. He told relatives that Dad had appointed him to invest the warehouse money, but I had seized the accounts out of jealousy. He showed an email in which Dad wrote, "If the numbers hold, the distribution plan could be yours." The sentence sounded convincing until read in context. Dad had been discussing a contractor delivery route Nolan proposed for Mercer Home Supply. The next paragraph required a feasibility study, board approval, and no use of trust funds. Nolan cropped all of that away. He also produced what he called a loan memorandum, dated 2 days before the accident. It authorized $1.85 million from the transition account to North Coast and bore Dad's electronic signature. Nolan sent it to employees, suppliers, and several family members before giving it to Miriam. That was his second serious mistake. The file metadata showed it had been created 4 hours after the funeral on the laptop he carried from Dad's study. The signature image came from a 20-month-old insurance form. By circulating it as authentic, Nolan changed the case from a disputed transfer into evidence of deliberate forgery and attempted obstruction. The formal trust meeting took place 3 days later in Miriam's office. Nolan arrived with his own lawyer and a confidence I could not understand until I saw the folder in his hand. He believed our parents' estate plan still named him chief executive and sole voting trustee, provisions contained in a draft Dad had discussed years earlier. Miriam read the current terms without drama. Company shares would remain in trust during a 12-month review. Employees and creditors came first. Both children remained beneficiaries. Management authority would be determined by qualifications, financial disclosures, and compliance with the conduct provision. When Miriam described the conduct provision, Nolan interrupted. He said no parent would punish a son for carrying out verbal instructions. His lawyer asked for proof that Nolan had knowingly acted without authority. Miriam placed 3 items on the table: the hospital inventory showing Nolan received the phone and token, the expired power of attorney he uploaded, and the bank recording in which he pretended to be Dad. Then she added the document he had forged after the funeral. The room went silent, except for the air conditioner. Nolan looked at me as though I had manufactured timestamps, call recordings, and his own voice. Miriam explained that the attempted transfer would be treated as an advance against Nolan's beneficial share, subject to restitution, fees, and losses. More importantly, concealment and falsification disqualified him from serving as trustee, director, or officer of any trust-controlled company. He had not been cut out of the inheritance. He had removed himself from control by doing exactly what our parents warned him not to do. The distinction made him furious. He wanted the story of a cruel sister stealing his birthright, because that story had a villain outside himself. A ledger gave him nowhere to put the blame. Nolan's lawyer requested a recess. In the hallway, Nolan cornered me near the elevators. He said I had planned this with Mom because she had always preferred me. The accusation was absurd enough to hurt. Mom had loved him fiercely. She had simply stopped financing his excuses. I told him our parents had left him half of everything remaining, which was more generosity than most people received after forging a deed. He said half was meaningless if I controlled it. I reminded him that an independent fiduciary, not I, would take over after 90 days. His anger faltered. Losing to me would have supported his grievance. Losing authority to a neutral professional meant the problem was his conduct. The independent review began with North Coast. What investigators found explained the urgency behind the funeral transfers. Nolan owed $620,000 to a private lender after speculating on a failed waterfront development. He had guaranteed equipment leases for a distribution business that owned no warehouse and had no customers. He owed the IRS payroll taxes for employees who appeared on promotional photographs but had not been paid regularly. Most dangerous of all, a $900,000 balloon payment was due the Monday after the funeral. Nolan had not emptied the account because grief made him reckless. He had scheduled the theft because his creditors had scheduled him. North Coast's financial statements claimed that Mercer Home Supply had committed to a 10-year exclusive delivery contract. The attached signature belonged to me. I had never seen the contract. Nolan had taken my signature from a payroll authorization and placed it beneath a paragraph identifying me as Chief Financial Officer and Authorized Trustee months before I held either trust role. The false contract allowed him to borrow against expected revenue. If the scheme collapsed, the lender could have sued Mercer and accused me of misrepresentation. Once again, Nolan's plan required me to exist as a useful signature and a disposable person. The discovery changed my grief. Until then, I had been moving through tasks, selecting cemetery plots, closing accounts, calling insurers, identifying Mom's handwriting on medication lists. Anger had given me temporary structure. When I saw my forged name, the structure broke. I went into Mom's sewing room, closed the door, and cried until breathing hurt. Not only because Nolan had betrayed me, but because my parents had died knowing their son might do this. Their careful restrictions were not abstract estate planning. They were the architecture of fear, built by two people who loved him and no longer trusted him. Inside Mom's desk, beneath fabric samples and old birthday cards, I found a sealed letter addressed to both children. I gave it to Miriam without opening it, and she confirmed it was referenced in the trust file as a personal statement rather than a legal amendment. We read it together during the next meeting. Dad wrote most of it, with notes added in Mom's hand. They said they had no desire to stage a contest between us. They loved Nolan's imagination and my steadiness. They regretted turning those qualities into roles that trapped us both. They admitted protecting Nolan from consequences until protection became a form of harm. The letter addressed the warehouse money directly. It was reserved for taxes, employee pensions, store modernization, and a possible buyout of longtime managers. Any remaining amount would join the general estate. No verbal promise authorized Nolan's project. Dad wrote that if Nolan believed otherwise, he should ask why a legitimate gift required secrecy. Mom added one sentence beneath it: "Grief does not create character. It removes the time people usually use to hide it." Hearing Miriam read those words, I remembered Nolan's blue phone glowing during the sermon and felt the unbearable precision of my mother's judgment. Nolan rejected the letter as manipulation. He claimed I had found it and could have altered it. A document examiner confirmed both sets of handwriting, paper age, ink sequence, and the impression left by Mom's note on the sheet beneath it. Miriam also had a scanned copy sent directly by our parents months earlier. Every attempt Nolan made to attack evidence created another opportunity to authenticate it. His lawyer began advising settlement. Nolan replaced him. The criminal investigation moved more slowly than family gossip. Police interviewed the nurse, the bank employee, the private lender, and staff who had received Nolan's forged memorandum. A forensic team imaged Dad's phone and found deleted messages between Nolan and his wife Paige. Before the funeral, Nolan had written that everyone would be distracted until the reception. Paige asked whether Elena could stop the transfer. Nolan answered that I only watched spreadsheets and would not understand until the money was beyond reach. He added that I would never call the police at our parents' funeral because I cared too much about looking respectable. That message was quoted months later at a hearing. Nolan had mistaken restraint for weakness because he believed power always announced itself. He did not understand the kind that documents create, the quiet authority of preserved logs, verified dates, independent witnesses, and rules applied without shouting. My silence in the chapel had not protected him. It had protected the evidence from becoming a chaotic family confrontation he could reinterpret. Paige contacted me after reading the messages in the prosecution's filing. She said she had believed the transfer was a legitimate advance and that Nolan was merely avoiding delays created by my hostility. Her claim was difficult to reconcile with her question about whether I could stop it, but she offered records in exchange for separate counsel and consideration from prosecutors. Those records showed that Nolan had opened a second account in her name, planned to move the money through a cryptocurrency broker, and booked flights to a country where North Coast claimed to be negotiating a supplier partnership. There was no supplier. There was a rented apartment and an application for residency through investment. The planned departure was why Nolan needed the full $1.846 million rather than only the balloon payment. He intended to pay immediate creditors, move the remainder abroad, and pressure the family into describing the transaction as a civil dispute. Once he controlled enough cash, he believed he could negotiate from safety. The funeral was not simply convenient timing, it was his exit window. While investigators worked, Mercer Home Supply began to wobble. Rumors frightened vendors. A bank suspended our line of credit after seeing the forged North Coast contract. Several employees wondered whether payroll money had vanished. I held a meeting in the warehouse break room and told them what I legally could. The attempted transfers had been frozen, operating accounts were separate, payroll was funded, and an independent fiduciary would supervise the company. I did not call Nolan a thief. Facts were sufficient. Afterward, our oldest driver, Luis, handed me a folder of delivery records Nolan had ordered him to destroy. Luis had kept them because Mom once told employees that no honest document needed to fear daylight. Those records revealed a longer pattern. For 2 years, Nolan had directed building materials to renovation sites owned by his friends, then coded them as damaged inventory or promotional samples. The amount was smaller than the funeral transfer, but still substantial, nearly $280,000 at retail value. A store manager had questioned the losses and was transferred. Another employee was given a poor review after refusing to backdate receipts. Nolan's entitlement had not appeared suddenly beside our parents' graves. It had been rehearsed in every consequence they softened. The board placed me in temporary operational control, not because of the trust letter, but because vendors and employees needed a responsible signer. I accepted with conditions: outside audits, 2 signature payments, direct reporting for the controller, and no permanent appointment until an external search was completed. Nolan told relatives I had achieved my goal. He posted online that while he mourned, his sister staged a corporate coup. Several cousins believed him because they had seen me leave the funeral in Miriam's car. They had not seen the bank alerts or the forged forms. Families often prefer a familiar personality story to an unfamiliar financial record. I stopped defending myself at family gatherings. Miriam issued one factual statement, denying that estate funds had been distributed and confirming that the trust was under independent administration. The bank filed its reports. The company published audited summaries. Whenever Nolan accused me of stealing power, I asked through counsel for one transaction, vote, or provision supporting the claim. He supplied emotion instead. Over time, the gap between his volume and the evidence became visible even to people determined not to choose sides. Our Aunt Deborah changed first. She had repeated Nolan's claim that Dad promised him the warehouse money. Then she remembered driving Dad home after the cabin dispute. She found a voice message he left by accident while speaking with Mom in the passenger seat. Dad said he feared Nolan would take the first liquid asset available if both parents were gone. Mom answered that they could not control Nolan's choice, only make the choice visible. Deborah gave the recording to Miriam and apologized to me. I did not enjoy being proven right. The recording made my parents' last months feel even lonelier. Nolan was arrested 11 weeks after the funeral on charges involving identity theft, attempted bank fraud, forgery, and unlawful use of an access device. News cameras waited outside the courthouse, but there was no dramatic raid. He surrendered through counsel wearing a dark suit and the expression he had used beside the grave. His statement called the matter an inheritance disagreement, criminalized by an ambitious sibling. The prosecutor did not mention me in response. She listed the deceased account holders, the expired authority, the false identity call, the fabricated medical emergency, and the post-funeral document. Removing me from the story made Nolan's choices clearer. He was released pending trial under travel restrictions and ordered not to contact trust employees. Within a week, he emailed Luis from an anonymous account and offered money to say that I had ordered the delivery records altered. Investigators traced the account to the guest network at a private club Nolan used. His bail conditions were tightened, and obstruction was added to the case. He continued treating every locked door as evidence that he needed another key. The civil case reached judgment first. The court confirmed the trust's conduct provision, charged Nolan's attempted transfer and related losses against his beneficial share, and permanently barred him from fiduciary or management roles in Mercer-controlled entities. After taxes, employee obligations, legal costs, and repayment for diverted inventory, Nolan's remaining inheritance was placed in a restricted trust, available for basic living expenses and restitution. He still received more than many people earn in years. He described it as being left with nothing because he could not command it. The company's future surprised everyone. The outside search selected Priya Nanduri, a retail operations executive with no connection to our family, as chief executive. I returned to my role as finance director and later moved to the board. Priya closed one unprofitable store, invested in contractor ordering systems, and created an employee profit-sharing plan. Revenue declined in the first year, while cash flow improved. Dad might initially have called that failure. Mom would have understood immediately. We stopped confusing expansion with health. The warehouse proceeds did what our parents intended. They paid estate taxes and protected the pension plan. They funded severance for employees affected by the store closing and helped longtime managers buy a minority stake. A portion renovated the oldest location, including wider aisles and a training room named for Ruth and Daniel Mercer. No building bore Nolan's name or mine. Our parents' legacy became something people could use, rather than a monument their children could fight over. Nolan's criminal trial began 14 months after the funeral. His defense argued that he believed Dad's verbal promise gave him authority, and that using the token was a technical shortcut during emotional distress. The prosecution played the 93-second bank call. Nolan's imitation of Dad was not perfect, but it carried Dad's slow cadence and the little cough he made before answering difficult questions. Hearing my dead father's voice borrowed to steal his money made the courtroom feel airless. Then came Nolan's lie about a daughter needing treatment, the split transfers, the cropped email, the forged memorandum, and the messages about moving funds abroad. I testified for less than 3 hours. The defense tried to turn the case into a lifelong competition, asking whether I resented Nolan's closeness with Dad and whether I benefited from his removal. I said resentment did not upload an expired power of attorney. I explained that my temporary authority ended by design, that an independent board chose the new chief executive, and that I had received no early distribution. When asked why I had not confronted Nolan during the funeral if I truly believed a crime was occurring, I answered that the bank had frozen the money, and that our parents deserved to be buried without their son using the altar as a courtroom. Celeste testified about the account controls. Miriam explained the trust. The document examiner traced the false signatures. Paige authenticated Nolan's messages. Luis described the inventory diversions. Each witness held one piece, and none needed to exaggerate. Nolan took the stand against advice. For 2 hours he described pressure, grief, promises, sacrifices, and my supposed campaign against him. Then the prosecutor asked one question. If he believed the money was his, why did he pretend to be a dead man? Nolan began answering before the question ended, but no answer reached it. The jury convicted him on all major counts. At sentencing, Dad's recorded concern and Mom's letter were admitted as evidence of prior warning, not to punish Nolan for family history, but to show he understood his lack of authority. Several employees submitted statements about threatened jobs and stolen inventory. I wrote only that grief had been transformed into an opportunity for fraud and that accountability should protect future victims, not satisfy my anger. Nolan received a prison sentence of 6 years, followed by supervised release and restitution. The judge noted that the attempted bank loss had been prevented, but the scheme was sophisticated, repeated, and committed while trust was unusually vulnerable. Before deputies led him away, Nolan looked back at me. For years, I had imagined what I might feel if consequences finally became unavoidable. Victory was not among the emotions that arrived. I felt grief for my parents, relief for the employees, anger at the brother who had weaponized our family's mercy, and sorrow for the boy who once taught me to ride a bicycle by running behind me until I stopped wobbling. Accountability did not erase love. It stopped love from being used as an alibi. Paige divorced him during the appeal. Some relatives returned quietly, offering apologies shaped more by the verdict than by reflection. I accepted a few and kept distance from others. Aunt Deborah became the only extended family member I saw regularly. She once asked whether I could ever forgive Nolan. I told her forgiveness was not an administrative task waiting on my desk. It might come, change, or never arrive. What mattered was that reconciliation would require truth, restitution, and safety. Blood could explain connection. It could not waive conditions. 2 years after sentencing, Nolan wrote from prison. The first letter blamed lenders, Dad's mixed messages, Paige's disloyalty, and my refusal to handle things privately. I returned it unread after the second page. The next letter arrived 8 months later and contained fewer excuses. He admitted taking the phone before we left the hospital. He admitted choosing the funeral because he thought I would be too ashamed to react. He admitted forging my signature on the North Coast contract because lenders trusted me more than him. That sentence revealed what rivalry had hidden. Nolan had never believed I was incapable. He believed my competence was family property he could use without consent. I answered once. I told him our parents had not destroyed his future by creating account controls. They had left him a future conditioned only on honesty. I had not taken his inheritance. He had spent part of it before it was his and converted the rest into restitution. The bank had not trapped him. It had recorded a choice. If he wanted a relationship after release, he would need to speak about that choice without placing anyone else in the position of cause. I did not promise forgiveness. I promised accuracy. My own inheritance was distributed after the estate closed. I used part of it to buy a modest home and invested the rest. I did not surrender it to prove moral purity. My parents worked for that money and deliberately left me a share. Accepting it did not make me greedy any more than protecting it made me cruel. Women in families like mine are often praised for being responsible until responsibility gives them authority. Then the same conduct is called control. I stopped translating competence into apology. On the 3rd anniversary of the funeral, I visited the cemetery early. The grass was wet and the training room at the renovated store was scheduled to open that afternoon. I brought no speech, only 2 small branches from Mom's lilac bush. At the graves, I thought about the final service, the alert, the blue phone, Nolan's bowed head, and my own silence. For years, that moment had felt like the instant our family broke. Standing there, I understood the family had broken much earlier. Each time consequences were postponed in the name of love. The funeral was merely when the account came due. The store opening was intentionally ordinary. Employees brought casseroles. Contractors leaned against stacks of lumber. Priya thanked the managers who had survived the transition, and Luis cut the ribbon because he had worked for our parents longer than anyone still on payroll. Inside the training room, a framed copy of Mom's favorite policy hung beside the door. No honest document needs to fear daylight. Visitors assumed it referred to bookkeeping. Those of us who knew the history understood it as a family lesson. A reporter covering the renovation asked whether the money Nolan tried to steal had been recovered. I said the transfers never left the bank, and most additional losses had been repaid through his estate charge and seized assets. She called that a happy ending. I told her recovery was not the same as restoration. We recovered dollars, records, and a company. We could not recover my parents' final weeks from fear, the employees' trust from uncertainty, or the version of my brother who might have learned after the cabin. Happy endings were too clean for what accountability actually did. It did not reverse harm. It prevented harm from writing the future alone. Mercer Home Supply eventually became employee majority owned. I voted for the transition because our parents' work had always depended on people whose names did not appear on the sign. I kept a small share and served one final board term, then left to advise family businesses on internal controls and succession. Clients often resisted restrictions because they worried safeguards signaled distrust. I told them controls were not declarations that everyone was dishonest. They were promises that honesty would not be left defenseless when someone was. I never used Nolan's name in presentations, but his lesson was present whenever I explained why powers of attorney end, why shared passwords create risk, why verbal promises should be documented, and why one charismatic relative should not control both money and the story about money. Technical safeguards matter, but culture decides whether warnings survive. My parents had possessed evidence after the cabin and still chose quiet rescue. Their later planning worked because they finally accepted that love without boundaries could finance destruction. Nolan was released after serving most of his sentence. He took a bookkeeping job arranged through a re-entry program, an irony he did not mention when we first met. We chose a public cafe. He looked older and less polished. For 40 minutes, he spoke without asking me to restore his access, repair his reputation, or explain him to relatives. He said prison had forced him to live inside schedules he could not charm. He had learned that intentions did not alter entries after the fact. I asked why he emptied the account during the funeral even after the cabin incident. His answer was plain. He believed Dad's death had erased the only person whose authority frightened him. He believed Mom's restrictions were paperwork I would be too emotional to enforce. Most of all, he believed the family would rather lose money than admit publicly what he had done. He was nearly right about our old family. He had not understood that our parents' final act was to change the rules under which silence operated. We did not embrace when we left. I agreed to meet again if he continued restitution and did not contact company employees. Trust would not return because he had completed punishment. It would be built, if at all, through small verified acts. That answer disappointed relatives who wanted a photograph of reconciliation. I had learned not to confuse a beautiful image with a stable structure. People still tell the story as though my brother took our parents' money and I cleverly took it back. The truth is less satisfying and more important. Nolan never possessed the money in the way he imagined. For a few minutes, a screen showed him a stolen future. Beneath that screen were controls, witnesses, logs, and instructions created by parents who finally understood that hope was not a financial system. He saw zero in their account and believed he had won. What he had actually done was sign his name in 4 separate transfers beneath every warning they had ever given him. At 11:17 on the morning of the funeral, I thought the number on my phone marked the end of my parents' life's work. Years later, I see it differently. The balance of $0.43 was not the truth. It was only the amount Nolan was allowed to see while the bank measured his choice. The real inheritance was still there. Wages protected, stores preserved, evidence secured, and boundaries strong enough to survive the people who resented them. My brother tried to empty our parents' account before the funeral even ended. Instead, he emptied the last excuse anyone had left for saving him from himself.